Hello, I'm Dr. Malcolm Ogborn, the Optimistic Doc. Today, I'd like to give you a few tips about having tricky conversations. So what's a tricky conversation? The simplest way of identifying a tricky conversation, I think, is just actually listening to your own bodily reactions. If you're lying awake at night rehearsing for a conversation, that's probably a tricky one. If you get a sense of anxiety or dread when you're approaching the conversation, that's definitely a tricky one. And I'm sure we've all had the experience of actually being in the conversation and realizing that this is not going in a direction that's going to end well. So, what would you prefer to have happen? Have you ever had a conversation where you came out of that with a real sense of achievement, that you really felt that you came out of it with a better understanding, or you found some new common ground with an individual, or there was a clear plan? That's the end result we really want to look for in a conversation. So how do we get there? Well, before we talk about that, I'd like to just sidetrack a little bit into the nature of experience. The poet John Keats said that nothing is real until it is experienced. The other side of that is that everybody's experience is in fact their reality. And frequently, when conversations go off the rails, it's not so much that people are wrong, it's that people start trying to tell other people what they are actually experiencing, rather than trying to understand something that is happening from a different point of view. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of experience. Now, the first part of experience is the actual physical sensory input: light, sound, smells, touch, pressure. Now, they're what's called objective reality. But in fact, objective reality gets very, very rapidly processed by those excellent brains of ours, largely subconsciously. Initially, we filter out a lot of things that aren't particularly relevant or just background noise. On top of that, we unconsciously apply filters that align what we see with important beliefs or previous experience of the world. And then on top of that, we interpret based on other experience and desires and wants that we have. And adding on top of that again, what we see and how we perceive will be influenced by our emotional response. A certain smell can bring up really positive, really negative feelings. A certain noise can have the same impact. Unrelated stimuli that are associated with those particular things that generate powerful emotional responses will begin to share those emotional responses. This gets really messy and complicated. Out of all that, we choose to speak or we choose to act. And in speaking and acting, we actually feed back into the loop. We further refine the filters on the sensory input. We reinforce often our own cognitive processing and ideas. So what often happens in a conversation is we don't sit there and discuss the objective reality, the actual sights, sounds, pressures, touch, smells. We discuss our very sophisticated and highly modified interpretation of it, and often we go straight to the wants. We actually state a position, make a demand, without any explanation of how we got to that particular position. And what that does is it lets other people fill in the story of how they think we got to that point. And that's often not a good place to be, because when humans tell stories, and we're very much a storytelling primate, there's usually only three roles that we get to pick in the story. We can be a hero, we can be a victim, or we can be a villain. And generally, we don't tend to write other people as heroes in our stories, particularly in tense or difficult situations. So if you have conversations in a way that you let other people write your story for you, you're at risk of being the villain a lot of the time. So let's look at a different approach. Now, the approach I'm talking about today comes from Gervais Bush in his model of leadership called Clear Leadership. And it's called the Experience Cube, and it has 4 elements: observations, thoughts, feelings, and wants. Now, a simple way of looking at this is to walk a conversation from observations through thoughts and feelings to wants, although in fact, in real life, often the conversation or the thought processes behind the conversation will jump backwards and forwards between the different elements. So, how do you talk about observations? Well, conversation helps keep you grounded in the quadrant of the cube. So if you use statements like I see, I hear, I observe, I read, I was told, it still takes some discipline and practice to actually make that statement without any colouring from thoughts, feelings, or other impressions. You then move on to thoughts. I think, obviously. I conclude. I infer. I deduce. The story I am telling myself is. That's actually a very powerful opening and a good way to reduce reactivity, because you're acknowledging to another individual that the interpretation that you're putting on the table is something that's derived and could be wrong. Feelings, I like, I don't like. I appreciate, I'm hurt by. I am concerned, worried, afraid. I am gratified. And then wants. I need to know more about. Can you help me understand how, what? I need you to. It would help me if. I want. What I would like to or hope to see or have happen. So what's the value of this approach? Well, the first is actually it's surprising how often viewpoints change and insights occur just by the act of sitting down and separating the elements of your perception. It's not unusual for people to find that when they tease out what they thought was happening versus what they actually saw, that they start coming up with alternative explanations for a situation, and it broadens their viewpoint. Likewise with their feelings. It avoids potentially accusatory you or why statements. You'll notice that actually in the want statement, I was very careful not to say, why did you do that? Or I need to know why you did that. There's something about why that sometimes will push buttons with people. And even though knowing why is a very, very important process in leadership, it's sometimes strategic to try and establish reasons by using different words. When you use this approach, it's very easy to acknowledge that you're talking about your reality and that you're open to the idea that other people might have seen it a different way. And that sets the stage, finding some common ground. But it is really only a starting point. Having gone through this exercise and made your case, you need to listen, you need to reflect on what you hear and what you've been told, and you need to then go through the cycle again and interpret the new information in a similar way. So if you want to know more about this model, I certainly would recommend Gervais Bush's book, Clear Leadership, which tells you a lot about this and a number of other strategies and approaches that are very, very important in the concept of learning organizations that truly reflect on their own experience to improve their productivity and quality of their work. There's a shorter version in the journal article listed on the slide, and a somewhat different approach, but one that has very many similar elements, can be found in the Crucial Conversations work, which is both available as a book and is also taught as courses. So if you'd like to know more about coaching activities that are available through the Optimistic Doc, please feel free to contact me through the website or by email or at the phone number indicated. Thank you for listening.